Hello again folks, and welcome to another screencast, and this time we're going to be looking at the second half of the 20th century Britain sport and society aspect. Now if you look back at the previous screencast, we managed to cover the 20th century Britain main characteristics which are on the screen. If you need more information about that, if you go back to the screencast prior to this, called 20th Century Britain 1. In that previous screencast, I covered social class, gender, time, money, and law and order. And so this screencast will complete the set and cover transport and education and how they affected 20th century British sport. So let's start with education. Prior to this, if you remember, at the end of the 1800s, we had the Forster Act of 1870, which meant that working class children could go to school as part of the state and they had some form of education. You also need to remember that the upper class and middle class sent their children to public schools, which required a lot of funding, a lot of money on their behalf, but they had that money. Working class individuals didn't have that access to money. Now in 1944, in this century, the 20th century, the Butler Education Act occurred. And the aim of the Butler Education Act was to provide more education for the whole person. A bit more of a holistic approach, so academic, spiritual, physical and vocational development of individuals who went to state school. So this was for the working class. The Butler Act affected the working class state schools. The Butler Act now changed the school leaving age to 15. Previously, it was around about 13 was the oldest you could stay at school, and prior to that you might be required by your family to go to work in order to earn an income and to earn for the family, and so education might not have been for everybody prior to this. But at this point, the government were introducing legislation that replaced all other acts and required children to stay at school until 15. The way this was implemented was through something called the 11 plus exam. And what happened was, at the end of your primary school year or preparatory school year in some areas of the country, you would sit a major exam called the 11 plus, and whether you passed or failed this 11 plus dictated as to what happened next in terms of your secondary school career. The government brought in 3 particular type of schools that were routes from the 11 plus exam. So we had grammar schools, secondary modern schools and secondary technical schools. So I'm going to go through each of these one by one. If you can make some notes on each particular school, and then we'll discuss how they impacted on sport in any way as we go along. So let's start with grammar schools. To begin with, and most importantly, you could only go to a grammar school such as Basvic, pictured in the screencast here in black and white, if you had passed the 11 plus exam. So you passed that 11 plus exam in your primary school, your preparatory school, and you were sent to grammar school. And this school provided your education from 11 years old to 19 years old. You had to be academically gifted, therefore, to enter grammar school. So it was starting to become elitist. You'd pass this major exam at a very young time frame in your life, and the elite gifted individuals went on to grammar school, where there was a full curricula for those individuals. So maths, English, sciences, but also physical education at this point. So there would have been a formal curriculum devised around the whole day. You'd be learning and you'd be in with other bright students. Once you'd finished grammar school, the majority of students who left grammar school went on to good standing universities, and so very quickly this became a rather middle class institution where, as I say, the elite individuals progressed up the ladder. You still had at this point upper class and very wealthy middle class parents sending their children to public schools. So the public schools were something else, but these now state-owned grammar schools was a free state education for individuals who passed the 11 plus exam and were for academically gifted individuals in that sense. So a very elitist sort of way of doing things. For those who failed the 11 plus exam, so 11 years old, you didn't pass that exam, you were sent to something called a secondary modern school. This secondary modern school tried to copy or emulate the grammar school. So it was sort of like the grammar school, but it was for people who were less talented academically because they'd failed that 11 plus exam. So a good example of this type of school in the Brighton Hove area would be Falmer School, which used to be an old secondary modern school. And as you can see on the screen, there were lots of different aspects you could study as part of your day for these individuals. So English, sciences, but of course if you take note, they would also have taught PE, so PE was on this syllabus. At the end of the 4th year that they were attending this school, the students had an option, because then when they were 15, so they could go to work, they could leave the school with no qualification, but they'd had some education, or they could sit the 5th year at that school and prepare for a general certificate in education, a GCE exam. And that led to the creation of the standardised certificate in secondary education in 1963. So this was very popular to get this certificate to show that you had a qualification through education, which was something that hadn't happened before for state-owned schools. Added to this, we had this other strand of schooling called a secondary technical school. So generally, people who'd failed the 11 plus exam went to secondary modern. So they started off in secondary modern and tried to fit into this system where they were taught sciences or maths or English or PE, religious studies, these sorts of subjects throughout the day. But at the age of 12 or 13, if they weren't really getting along with this idea of studying these subjects in a curriculum format, they could apply to go to a secondary technical school. And that secondary technical school would then concentrate purely on industry-related jobs or vocational experience. So things like plumbing, building, carpentry, and form the basis of a route into work for these individuals that academia didn't quite suit. Now, what you need to understand about those 3 types of schools and what the Butler Act did in this time frame is how it had some form of impact on sport in this time period. So on the screen, I've sort of separated each particular school and discussed briefly what the impacts were. So if you look at the public schools were in a league of their own. They had fee-paying parents. So the upper class and middle class paid an awful lot of money to send their children to public school. It's the same for private schools now. And that meant these public schools could afford vast facilities, changing rooms, gymnasiums, equestrian centres, rugby pitches, football pitches, you name it, they could have paid for it because the funding was there. That means in terms of sport, they can access a great range of sports in terms of what they can actually do within the school day. There would be an elite competitive teams. They would have played games against other public schools who would have been of a high standard. So competition level would have been very high at a public school. They would have also had PE on the curriculum, as with all the other types of schools, so formal teaching of PE. And another thing to note about public schools is they often employed ex-professional coaches. So the standard of coaching and technical ability you could develop in a sport at public school far outweighed anything else any state school could give you. Grammar schools, which was the next best thing if you had a free education, were quite like the public schools, just not as rich. They would have had competitive sports teams, which would have only played against other grammar schools, so again, promoting this idea of elitism, or the better sort of sports performers playing against each other. PE would have been part of their daily curriculum, so it would have been on the study list for a student at grammar school, and they would have had some after school curricular activity, so extracurricular provision. So they would have had some coaching, some sports teams, not to the level of public schools of course, but they would have had that option. Secondary modern schools were a step down from this. They still had a range of sports teams, namely the more popular sports such as football, netball, rugby, cricket. PE would have been on their curriculum. They would have only played fixtures against other secondary modern schools, of course, and so that limited the competitiveness between those players playing. And they would have had some extracurricular provision too. So they would have had some coaching, probably from teachers, after school for different sports that were being played at the time. And then finally, you've got the secondary technical schools. Of course, they're primarily there for work in terms of what the students are doing. So it was very limited in terms of sports teams. They might have had an after school football team or a cricket team or a rugby team if enough students were interested in playing that sport. But it was quite limited because the basis of that secondary technical school was for employment and developing vocational careers. They would have also had some extracurricular provision, again provided by teachers if they were able to do this within the time frame. So you can quickly see, as a rule of thumb, all of these schools had some form of sports provision provided, much more so than in the previous century. They all had sports teams develop, and this idea of a curricula for PE for the vast majority of these schools had occurred. Moving on to the final factor, which is transport. Now on the screen, this is your first task with transport. I would like you to look at all the different pictures. I'm going to go for each picture to make sure you understand what each one is. And I'd like you to find out, firstly, when it was invented. Secondly, when commercial trips were performed for the general public. Now, when I mean commercial trips, it means if some working class individual wanted to take the bus or the Eurotunnel, for example, when was that possible? So when was it more commercially viable to take that option as a form of transport? So from the top left, we've got the hovercraft. Moving across to the top middle, we have the tram. Top right is a commercial aeroplane. So not a private plane, but a commercial one. Underneath the hovercraft, we have private airline or private planes. We've then got the motor car in the middle of your screen. And then below that on bottom left, we've got cruise ships or steamliners. Underneath that, we've got the bus, of course. And then finally, the Eurotunnel in this particular time frame. So if you could find out the dates when these things became available to the general public, that will give you some idea of how transport developed in this particular century. In terms of its impact, well, this was usually linked to two things. Firstly, the radio. The radio had a big impact on sport in this time frame because people had more of an interest in sport. And so games were then covered by radio coverage initially. People would tune in to a game on a Saturday afternoon and become interested in the score, interested in what was going on. This then expanded once television was introduced in the late 1950s, early 60s. And you've then got coverage of games starting to be introduced from the 70s onwards on television, right up until Sky Television was introduced in the early 1990s. And so sport became a real spectator interest. And because there was more access to public and private transport by the end of the 20th century, it meant that, added to this interest in sport, participation rates in sport increased quite dramatically from the start of the century to the end of the century. Spectator rates also increased massively. People could get around far easier to fixtures, they could pay for tickets, they could go and watch games live. Whereas in the previous century, just didn't occur. You only had the train, and that was for the second half of that century when you could afford a third-class ticket, when spectatorism gave interest to the working class. But at this point in time, in the 20th century, we had much more different transport routes. Spectatorism could occur through lots of different avenues. The knock-on effect of all of that meant that increased attendance of clubs or whole country teams to global events. We had the Olympics. So the 1948 London Olympics was an opportunity for London to become a host city of the Olympics. This meant they could advertise the country. They call it the shop window effect. So this idea of transport and options of people travelling around meant that other countries could visit London, see how brilliant London was as a place and a city, and advertise the UK as a whole. So all this was a massive development from this idea of further transport, meaning that London, the economy could strengthen, Britain could be advertised. You had other global events such as World Cups, which also provided a shop window effect. The World Cup in England 1966. You also had Euro 96 at the end of the century, which advertised England as a country because people could get to and from these events and into the country. You also had other good examples of this, so the Five Nations in rugby and the major European Cup competitions in football called the European Cup and the UEFA Cup. So this really sped up increased international competitions between countries and between international clubs. Okay, once again, thanks for watching. If you need any more support with your OCR A-Level PE course, please head to the iSpeakpe channel on YouTube, and I'll see you again next time.